She stayed silent when they mocked her accent, kept her head down when they excluded her from projects. But the day they made her feel ashamed of her own name, that's when her grandmother finally spoke up. It happened during third period English, right in front of Mrs. Henderson's advanced literature class. Maya Anaya sat in the second row, her worn notebook open to a page filled with careful annotations about the kite runner. She loved this book, connected with Hassan's struggle in ways her classmates couldn't understand. At 16, she was already fluent in 3 languages, carried a 4.2 GPA, and dreamed of studying international law at Georgetown. She'd been in America for 4 years now, ever since her family fled the violence in El Salvador, but Roosevelt High in suburban Denver still felt like foreign territory. That Tuesday morning, everything changed. Mrs. Henderson had assigned oral presentations on themes of displacement and identity. Maya had spent weeks preparing, practicing her pronunciation in the mirror, making sure every word was perfect. She understood the material better than most, lived it, breathed it, but still felt the familiar knot in her stomach whenever she had to speak in front of the class. Maya Anaya, Mrs. Henderson called from her desk. Maya stood, smoothing her thrift store blazer, the one her abuela had helped her pick out because it looked professional. She walked to the front of the classroom, her presentation notes trembling slightly in her hands. "Good morning," she began, her slight accent coloring the words despite her careful preparation. "Today I want to discuss how Hosseini uses Hassan's character to explore the lasting impact of—" "Can you speak English, please?" The voice cut through her sentence like a blade. The classroom went dead silent. Maya's words died in her throat. She looked up to see Bryce Morrison smirking from the back row, his baseball letterman jacket stretched across his broad shoulders. A few students giggled nervously. Most looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Henderson's mouth opened, but no words came out. Maya felt the heat rise to her cheeks. I am speaking English," she said quietly. "Barely," Bryce muttered, "loud enough for everyone to hear. Maybe try it without the accent next time. This is America." More silence. Then Madison Parker, Bryce's girlfriend and student council president, added with fake sweetness, "I mean, it's just hard to understand sometimes. Maybe you could, practice more?" Maya stood frozen at the front of the room, 30 pairs of eyes boring into her. Her carefully prepared words vanished. Her confidence crumbled. The presentation she'd worked so hard on, the analysis that came from her own lived experience of displacement, suddenly felt worthless. Mrs. Henderson finally found her voice. That's enough. Maya, please continue." But Maya couldn't. She looked down at her notes, the letters blurring together. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I need a moment." She walked back to her seat, her face burning with shame. The rest of the class period passed in a blur. When the bell rang, Maya was the first one out the door. Maya didn't run to the bathroom to cry. She didn't call her parents or skip her next class. She went to the library, sat in the back corner behind the Spanish literature section, and tried to steady her breathing. But something had shifted, because this wasn't the first time. It had started small, almost invisible. When she first arrived at Roosevelt High as a sophomore, she'd been placed in regular classes despite her high test scores. English as a second language pathway, they called it, even though her English was better than half the native speakers. It took her mother, Carmen, 3 meetings with a guidance counselor and a stack of transcripts from El Salvador to get Maya moved to honors classes. Then there were the group projects where she'd volunteer ideas only to be ignored until someone else would suggest the exact same thing 5 minutes later and receive praise. The time she'd raise her hand to answer questions about Latin American history or literature, subjects she knew intimately, only to see teachers' surprised faces, as if they'd forgotten she might have something valuable to contribute. But the worst part wasn't the exclusion. It was the way some classmates spoke to her, slowly, loudly, as if volume could bridge the gap they perceived between them. The way they'd compliment her English like it was a party trick. The way they'd ask where she was really from when she said Denver, as if her presence here needed constant justification. Maya had learned to navigate it all with quiet dignity. She focused on her grades, her future, her family's sacrifices. She told herself it would get better in college, in the real world, anywhere but here. But today, something had broken. That evening, Maya sat at the kitchen table in their small apartment, staring at her half-finished presentation. The smell of her grandmother's pupusas filled the air, usually a comfort. But tonight it felt like a reminder of everything that made her different. Her abuela, Isabella, moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency despite her 72 years. She'd lived through civil war, poverty, and the dangerous journey north to give her family a better life. Her hands were weathered from decades of cleaning office buildings, but her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "Kate, paso, mija?" Isabella asked, switching effortlessly between Spanish and English, as she always did. "You look like someone stole your smile." Maya hesitated. Her family had sacrificed everything for her education, worked multiple jobs to keep her in this good school district. How could she tell them it wasn't working? That despite their efforts, she still felt like an outsider? "It's nothing, abuela, just a bad day at school." Isabella dried her hands on a dish towel and sat down across from Maya. Her grandmother had a way of looking at people that made hiding impossible. "Tell me about this nothing," she said. So Maya told her about Bryce and Madison, about the presentation she couldn't finish, about the way her classmates made her feel like her voice didn't belong, like her accent was something to be ashamed of. Isabella listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When Maya finished, her grandmother was quiet for a long moment. "You know," Isabella finally said, "I came to this country speaking no English. Your grandfather worked construction. I cleaned offices. People looked at us like we were invisible, or worse, like we were taking something that didn't belong to us." Maya nodded. She'd heard these stories before. "But you know what I learned, mija? My voice carries the voices of all the women in our family who never got to speak. Your accent? It's not something to hide. It's proof of how far you've traveled, how much you've overcome." Isabella reached across the table and took Maya's hands. "Tomorrow, you're going to finish that presentation, and you're going to give it in your voice with your accent, with your truth. Because that boy who mocked you, he speaks one language and thinks he's superior. You speak three and apologize for it. But, abuela, what if they don't listen? What if it happens again?" Isabella's eyes flashed with something Maya had never seen before. Not anger, exactly, but determination. "Then we make sure they listen." That night, Isabella did something she'd never done in 4 years of Maya's high school career. She called in sick to her night shift at the office building downtown. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table with Maya's laptop, a device she usually avoided, and began what she called her research. Maya had gone to bed, but Isabella stayed up, navigating websites with the same methodical approach she used for everything else. By morning, Isabella had compiled a folder of information that would have impressed any investigative journalist. Roosevelt High's diversity statistics, the school board stated commitment to inclusive education, federal guidelines about discrimination and harassment, local news articles about similar incidents at other schools. But more than that, she found Roosevelt High's own mission statement, prominently displayed on their website, preparing global citizens for an interconnected world by celebrating diverse perspectives and fostering inclusive dialogue. Isabella printed everything. Then she made a list of phone numbers. The principal, the school board, the local chapter of the League of United Latin American Citizens, and a civil rights attorney, whose name she'd found in a news article about educational discrimination. She wasn't finished yet. When Maya came down for breakfast, she found her grandmother dressed in her best outfit, a navy blue dress she usually reserved for church, sitting at the table with the folder neatly organized beside her. "Abuela, what's all this?" "This," Isabella said, "is what happens when someone mistakes our kindness for weakness." Maya felt a flutter of anxiety. "What are you going to do?" "We are going to school today. Together. But your job." "Some things are more important than one day's pay, mija. Today, you're going to finish your presentation. And I'm going to make sure everyone understands the value of what you have to say." Maya walked into Roosevelt High that morning with her grandmother beside her. Isabella moved with quiet authority, her folder tucked under her arm, her eyes taking in everything, The hallways lined with college pennants, the trophy cases, the motivational posters about reaching your potential. Students stared. They weren't used to seeing grandmothers in the halls, especially not ones who carried themselves like Isabella did. Maya felt a familiar heat of embarrassment creeping up her neck. But this time it was different. This time, she wasn't alone. They went to the principal's office first. Dr. Patricia Collins was a woman in her 50s who'd built her career on maintaining order and avoiding controversy. She smiled politely when Maya and Isabella were announced, expecting a routine parent conference. "Mrs. Anaya, how can I help you today?" Isabella didn't sit down. She opened her folder and placed a printed copy of Roosevelt High's mission statement on the desk. "Yesterday, my granddaughter was humiliated in your classroom for the crime of speaking with an accent," Isabella said, her English clear and precise despite the slight inflection that revealed her origins. "I'm here to understand how that aligns with your mission to celebrate diverse perspectives." Dr. Collins shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Isabella interrupted gently but firmly. "Your student called my granddaughter's English inadequate, in front of 30 classmates, in a class about literature that explores themes of displacement and identity. The irony, I think, is not lost on anyone." Isabella placed more documents on the desk. "These are Maya's grades, her test scores, her college acceptance letters. This girl you allowed to be mocked for her accent? She's in the top 5% of your school. She speaks 3 languages fluently. She's going to Georgetown University next year to study international law." Dr. Collins picked up the papers, her expression changing as she scanned them. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "That's the problem," Isabella replied. "You don't know your students. You don't know their stories, their struggles, their strengths. You see my granddaughter as a charity case, someone to be tolerated rather than celebrated. But she's not here because of your generosity. She's here because she earned it." Maya watched her grandmother in amazement. This was a woman who cleaned office buildings at night, who sometimes struggled with complex English phrases, who'd always been humble about her own intelligence. But here, fighting for her granddaughter, Isabella was formidable. "What would you like me to do?" Dr. Collins asked. Isabella smiled, not warmly, but with satisfaction. "First, Maya's going to finish her presentation today, in front of the same class, and you're going to be there to ensure she's treated with the respect she deserves." "Of course, but—" "Second, we're going to have a conversation about your diversity and inclusion policies, because apparently they exist on paper but not in practice." Dr. Collins nodded, making notes. "Third, the students who disrupted her presentation yesterday are going to learn about the difference between free speech and harassment. I have some education materials they might find enlightening." Isabella closed her folder. "I've been in this country for 20 years, Dr. Collins. I've cleaned your offices, raised your children's classmates, contributed to your community. I've done it quietly, with dignity, asking for nothing but the chance to make a better life for my family. But when you allow my granddaughter to be treated as less than, that silence ends." Third period English arrived with electricity in the air. Word had spread through the school's invisible network that something was happening. Students filed into Mrs. Henderson's classroom with more attention than usual, stealing glances at Maya, who sat with her presentation notes neatly arranged. Mrs. Henderson looked nervous. Dr. Collins sat in a chair at the back of the room, her presence unusual and unmistakable. And in the corner, almost invisible but somehow commanding the space, sat Isabella. "Maya," Mrs. Henderson said when the bell rang, "would you like to complete your presentation from yesterday?" Maya stood, her hands steadier than they'd been in 24 hours. She walked in front of the classroom and looked out at her classmates. Bryce sat in his usual spot, no longer smirking. Madison stared at her desk. "Good morning," Maya began, her voice clear and strong. "Yesterday, I started to tell you about how Khaled Hosseini uses Hassan's character to explore the lasting impact of displacement and identity. I'd like to finish that conversation today." She looked directly at Bryce. "Some of you might find my accent distracting. That's your choice. But this accent carries the story of my family's journey from El Salvador to Colorado. It carries the voices of my grandparents who worked in fields so their children could work in offices. It carries the dreams of my parents who crossed the desert so I could stand in this classroom today. The room was completely silent. Hassan, in The Kite Runner, is dismissed by those around him because of his ethnicity, his social class, his perceived otherness. But Hassan's voice is truth, is what ultimately drives the entire narrative. His story matters not despite his differences, but because of them. Maya began to warm to her topic, the analysis she prepared flowing naturally despite her nervousness. Hosseini shows us that the stories we dismiss, the voices we silence, the perspectives we ignore, these are often the ones that have the most to teach us about courage, loyalty, and what it means to be human. She looked around the room, making eye contact with classmates who'd never really seen her before. I came to this school 4 years ago, speaking 3 languages, but feeling voiceless. I learned your history, your literature, your way of seeing the world. But I also brought my own history, my own perspective, my own way of understanding the human experience. Maya's voice grew stronger. You can choose to hear only what sounds familiar to you, or you can choose to listen to something new. Hassan's story changed Amir forever because Amir finally chose to listen. The question is, what are you choosing? She returned to her analysis of the novel, weaving in themes of privilege, responsibility, and redemption with an insight that came from lived experience. When she finished, the classroom erupted in applause, genuine, sustained applause that surprised everyone, including Maya. Mrs. Henderson wiped her eyes. "Thank you, Maya. That was extraordinary." Dr. Collins stood up from the back of the room. "I'd like to say something, if I may." She looked around the classroom. Yesterday, this classroom became a place where a student was made to feel ashamed of her voice. Today, we've heard what happens when that voice is finally allowed to speak freely. I hope we've all learned something about the difference. After class, students approached Maya in a way they never had before. Some apologized for their silence the day before. Others asked questions about her analysis, her background, her perspective on other books they were reading. Bryce Morrison didn't approach her that day, or the next, but a week later, he found her in the library. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, looking uncomfortable but determined. "What I said was wrong. Ignorant. I'm sorry." Maya looked up from her homework. "Thank you. Can I ask you something?" Bryce sat down across from her. "How do you do it? Know so much about everything. I mean, the way you talk about that book. I've read it 3 times and never caught half of what you were saying." Maya considered her answer, maybe because I've lived parts of it. When you've been the outsider, you see things differently. You notice who has power and who doesn't, who gets heard and who gets ignored. Bryce nodded slowly. "I never thought about that." "Most people don't have to," Maya said. "That's what privilege means." It wasn't a harsh accusation, just a statement of fact. Bryce absorbed it. Would you mind helping me with my next presentation? I think I could learn something from your perspective." Maya smiled, genuinely smiled. "I like that." Word of Maya's presentation and Isabella's intervention spread beyond Roosevelt High. The local Spanish-language newspaper ran a story about the grandmother who stood up for her granddaughter's right to speak with dignity. The school district's diversity committee invited Maya to speak at their next meeting. But the most important changes happened quietly in everyday moments. Mrs. Henderson restructured her class discussions to make space for different perspectives. Dr. Collins instituted new training for teachers about recognizing and addressing microaggressions. The school's English as a second language support was expanded and rebranded as Multilingual Excellence. Maya started a club called Global Voices, where students could share stories from their own cultural backgrounds. It became one of the most popular organizations at the school, with students from dozens of different countries and communities. And Isabella? She became something of a legend among the school's immigrant families. Parents who'd been silently struggling with their own children's experiences began reaching out to her for advice. She started attending school board meetings, always prepared with her folders of research and her quiet, unshakable dignity. "You know," Isabella told Maya one evening as they worked on college applications together, "I spent 20 years trying to make myself invisible. trying not to cause trouble, not to draw attention. I thought that was protecting you. It was, Maya said, you gave me a safe space to grow. But now you're grown, Isabella replied, and silence isn't protection anymore. Sometimes love means making noise. Maya's graduation speech as valedictorian brought the entire auditorium to its feet. She spoke about bridges, the ones we build between languages, cultures, and communities. She talked about the strength that comes from carrying multiple worlds within yourself. 4 years ago, I walked into Roosevelt High feeling like I had to choose between my voice and my belonging, she said, looking at her classmates. Today, I know that was a false choice. My voice is my belonging. Your voice is your belonging. The question isn't whether we sound the same. It's whether we're brave enough to listen to each other. In the audience, Isabella sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face. Beside her sat Carmen and Eduardo, Maya's parents, who'd worked double shifts for years to make this moment possible. After the ceremony, as families milled around taking pictures, Dr. Collins approached Isabella. Mrs. Anaya, I wanted to thank you, she said. What you did that day, it changed our school. It changed me. Isabella smiled. Education goes both ways, Dr. Collins. My granddaughter taught your students about literature. I taught your administration about justice. We all learned something. Dr. Collins laughed. Indeed we did. Where's Maya heading for college? Georgetown, Isabella said with unmistakable pride. International law. She's going to change the world. I have no doubt, Dr. Collins replied. She certainly changed ours. Years later, when Maya was working as a civil rights attorney, she would often think about that day in Mrs. Henderson's classroom. Not the humiliation of being silenced, but the power of finding her voice again. She kept a photo on her desk, her grandmother in that navy blue dress, sitting in the corner of the classroom, watching Maya reclaim her space. Isabella had passed away during Maya's second year of law school, but her lessons lived on. Mi nieta, Isabella had said during one of their last conversations, you have learned the most important lesson. Your voice is not an accident. It's a responsibility. Use it for those who cannot yet use theirs. And Maya did. She took on cases involving educational discrimination, immigrant rights, and language access. She spoke at schools and conferences about the power of multilingual education. She wrote articles about the difference between assimilation and belonging. But most importantly, she never forgot the 16-year-old girl who'd been made to feel ashamed of her accent because that girl had taught her something invaluable. Sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to disappear. What's the lesson here? Your voice matters not despite your differences, but because of them. The things that make you unique, your accent, your perspective, your story, these aren't obstacles to overcome. They're gifts to share. If someone has ever made you feel like your voice doesn't belong, remember Maya and Isabella. Remember that silence isn't always safety, and sometimes love means making noise. Remember that bridges aren't built by people who sound the same. They're built by people brave enough to speak their truth and wise enough to listen to others. And remember this. In a world that often rewards conformity, choosing to be authentically yourself is not just personal courage. It's a gift to everyone around you who's still afraid to be themselves. Because real change doesn't start with everyone sounding the same. It starts with everyone being heard.